Hi, and welcome back to Heimler's History. So back in the 1950s, when white Americans were shaking their hips to Elvis Presley and smoking only the cigarettes their doctors recommended, black Americans in the South were drinking out of colored-only water fountains and attending public schools which were apparently separate but equal. And as you can imagine, this arrangement could not last forever, and so let's see what happened in the civil rights movement of the 1960s. Let's get to it.
It's time to kick it old school.
So by 1950, there were over 15 million black citizens living in America, most of which were located in the South. And even though the 14th Amendment was ratified in 1868 and granted black Americans citizenship and full protection under the law, those wily white folks in the South figured out a way to wiggle around the Constitution and implement a series of laws meant to reinforce the inferiority of blacks. These were known as Jim Crow laws, and they provided for separate schools for whites and blacks, separate bathrooms, separate sections in restaurants and buses. Dang near anything that could be segregated, Jim Crow segregated. And this arrangement was even upheld by the Supreme Court in a case called Plessy versus Ferguson. What the court said in this case was that segregation was constitutional as long as those separate entities are equal. The problem was, even though everything was separate, it was surely not equal. Let me give you an example with an illustration of a woman who lived through the Jim Crow South. She said, "You could not go to a white restaurant. You sat in a special place at the movie house, and Lord knows you sat in the back of the bus. It didn't make any difference if you were rich or poor. If you were black, you were nothing. You might have $100 in your pocket, but if you went to the store, you would wait at the side until all the clerks got through with all the white folks, no matter if they didn't have change for $1. Then the clerk would finally look at you and say, 'Oh, did you want something? I didn't see you there.'" But there was a storm brewing in the Jim Crow South. More and more black folks refused to suffer such indignities quietly. And here's where I get to introduce you to Rosa Parks. In the winter of 1955, this small black woman boarded a bus in Montgomery, Alabama, and sat in the front of the bus's colored section. Soon the bus grew crowded, and when the driver noticed that there were white folks standing up, he began to ask the black folks to give up their seats for the white passengers. Now the black folks obliged, and with white folks still standing, the bus driver arrived at the seat on which Rosa Parks sat. He asked her to get up and go to the back of the bus, and in a small act that would eventually reverberate through the ages, she said, "No." And for that refusal, she was promptly arrested. Now, Rosa Parks had been an activist with the NAACP for years, and when she later reflected on that moment, she said, "People always say that I didn't give up my seat because I was tired, but that isn't true. I was not tired physically, or no more tired than I usually was at the end of a working day. I was not old, although some people have an image of me as being old then. I was 42. No. The only tired I was tired of giving in." And with a catalyst called Rosa Parks, blacks in Montgomery launched a year-long bus boycott called the Montgomery Bus Boycott, which, in addition to putting pressure on the economics of the public transportation system, had the symbolic effect of declaring that blacks in Alabama would no longer submit to a system so powerfully corrupted by injustice. In the midst of all this, there was a major legislative victory in 1954 called Brown versus the Board of Education, which effectively overturned the separate but equal doctrine found in Plessy versus Ferguson. In the Brown decision, the Supreme Court justices ruled that separate was fundamentally unequal. The court said that schools and every other segregated entity must be desegregated with, quote, "all deliberate speed." Now come on, Supreme Court, you know you can't say something that vague to the Jim Crow Southerners. All deliberate speed. Well, hold your britches, I'm going fast as I can. And that's about how it went, because 10 years after the Brown decision, only 2% of blacks in the Deep South were sitting in classrooms with whites. Even President Eisenhower seemed reluctant to promote integration on account of he didn't believe that, quote, "prejudices, even palpably unjustifiable prejudices, will succumb to compulsion." And on that point, I happen to agree with old Ike. It is true that prejudice cannot be legislated away. But a young Baptist preacher by the name of Martin Luther King Jr. saw things a little bit differently, and I would like to quote from him at length, and it is so magnificent that I hope you will indulge me. Now, the other myth that gets around, King says, is the idea that legislation cannot really solve the problem and that it has no great role to play in this period of social change because you've got to change the heart, and you can't change the heart through legislation. You can't legislate morals. The job must be done through education and religion. Well, there's a half-truth involved here. Certainly, if the problem is to be solved, then, in the final sense, hearts must be changed. Religion and education must play a great role in changing the heart. But we must go on to say that while it may be true that morality cannot be legislated, behavior can be regulated. It may be true that the law cannot change the heart, but it can restrain the heartless. It may be true that the law cannot make a man love me, but it can keep him from lynching me. And I think that is pretty important also. And so the decision in Brown versus the Board of Education stood as the final interpretation of the law of our land, and in September of 1957 we saw just how ineffective laws are at legislating morality and changing the heart. In Little Rock, Arkansas, Governor Orval Faubus called up the National Guard to block the entrance of Central High School in order to prevent 9 black students from taking their place in the student body. And now old Eisenhower was in a bind. He believed, you'll remember, that morality could not be legislated, but when a state governor so blatantly challenged federal authority, the old D-Day invasion of Normandy punched the Germans in their lederhosen. Eisenhower woke up and set federal troops to accompany these 9 students into their classes. Meanwhile, back in Alabama, Martin Luther King started the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which aimed to mobilize black church congregations in the cause of civil rights. But there were also more spontaneous iterations of resistance, like the sit-in movements, in which black folks would show up to white-only establishments and demand service. And more people began to join these nonviolent protests until finally businesses across the South were being seriously obstructed. And some of these nonviolent protesters paid dearly for their resistance. Though their demonstrations were, under the leadership and vision of Martin Luther King, always peaceful, police unleashed dogs on them and pounded them with fire hoses so powerful that children were swept away under the pressure like tumbleweeds. Much of this was televised, and more Americans recoiled in horror at the brutality and injustices they were witnessing. But even with such resistance, the movement was picking up steam. In August of 1963, Martin Luther King led upwards of 200,000 protesters to gather outside the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. in what became known as the March on Washington. And it was here in the sweltering southern heat that King delivered one of the most magnificent speeches in all American history, I Have a Dream. And the very next year, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed into law the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which banned segregation and racial discrimination in any facility open to the public. Now, among other things, this gave the federal government more legislative muscle to desegregate schools. But the problem of voting rights still remained. The next year, Johnson signed into law the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which outlawed literacy tests and other tactics to keep black people away from the polls. And as it happened, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was signed into law exactly 100 years after the end of the Civil War in 1865, in which black citizens, by constitutional amendment, received their voting rights. Now, as I've already mentioned, you can put laws into place all day long, but those laws are not going to change people's hearts. And so even though these landmark pieces of legislation had been established, black folks in the South still bore the hatred and underhanded discrimination of the white folks. And at this point, there was a large contingent of folks who were growing tired of Martin Luther King's nonviolent principles, and so it's time to introduce you to Malcolm X. Malcolm X was inspired by the militant black nationalists in the Nation of Islam, and by his charismatic preaching about black separatism and white devils, he gathered a growing crowd who no longer wanted to turn the other cheek, but who wanted to clench their fists and start pounding on white cheeks. This attitude gathered steam in California with the establishment of the Black Panther Party, and black Americans began to organize under the banner of Black Power, which intended to, in the words of Stokely Carmichael, smash everything Western civilization has created. But as long as Martin Luther King was still alive, he would urge his brothers and sisters towards nonviolence. But his moderating voice was silenced on April 4th, 1968, when, on a motel balcony in Memphis, Tennessee, a sniper's bullet tore through his body and made a martyr out of him. But it wasn't for nothing. Even though black folks folks began rioting across the country at the news of King's death, even more upheld King's peaceful legacy and registered to vote in astonishing numbers. By the late 1960s, hundreds of black people held elected office in the Deep South. And by 1972, half of all black children in the South sat in integrated classrooms. And although their journey has not yet reached its conclusion, all of this is a legacy which the members of the civil rights movement can raise their glasses and celebrate. And I celebrate with them. I'll see you next time.